Sophie Caldwell smoothed the olive green vintage dress she had worn for the 30th time since leaving her tiny apartment. Under the warm golden light of her bedroom, it had looked charming, elegant even. But here, inside the glittering crystal ballroom of the Astoria Grand Hotel, it made her feel like a wild daisy lost in a garden of designer orchids. She paused beneath the shimmering chandeliers, letting out a quiet breath as she took in the scene. The wedding was for a distant relative on her mother's side, the bride being the daughter of a cousin she had only met a handful of times. Her mother was supposed to attend with her, but had fallen ill last minute. And just like that, Sophie became the family's lone representative. The ballroom looked like something out of a fairy tale. Round tables draped in white silk, candles flickering against marble floors, and white roses cascading from the ceiling. Everyone around her looked effortlessly polished. Custom suits, sleek hairstyles, expensive shoes. And Sophie, with her thrifted dress and small clutch, felt like a misplaced note in a symphony. Table 8? 9? Right 9, she muttered, checking the elegant invitation card in her hand. Table 9 was tucked behind a towering floral installation, barely touched by the ballroom spotlight. The kind of table meant for overflow guests, the distant relatives, solo attendees, the ones no one quite knew where to place. She sat down carefully, adjusting the hem of her dress, and glanced around at the lively conversations buzzing at her table. European vacations, real estate investments, private yachts. Sophie picked at her salad, pretending to be focused on her plate, trying to disappear among people who didn't even notice she was there. Sophie nudged bits of salad around her plate, pretending to be busy. Then a deep, warm voice cut through the hum of conversation. "Is this seat taken?" She looked up and for a moment forgot how to breathe. Standing beside her was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a face so sharply handsome it looked carved. His light gray eyes met hers with calm interest, and his dark brown hair was styled just enough to seem deliberate but not overly polished. He wore a perfectly tailored black tuxedo that shimmered subtly under the lights like it had been designed for this very evening. "No, please," Sophie stammered, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. The man sat with effortless ease. A clean, woodsy cologne lingered in the air, elegant but understated. He extended a hand toward her, his smile warm and easy. "Julian Hart," he said. "And you are?" "Sophie Caldwell," she replied, shaking his hand and trying to ignore the strange current that traveled up her arm at his touch. "Bride's side or groom's?" Julian asked, his eyes still holding hers. "Bride's," Sophie said with a shy smile. "My aunt is her mom. I'm a distant cousin, here in place of my mother. She came down with a cold last minute." "Actually, I'm the groom's best friend," Julian said with a small smile. "But I've been hiding from my groomsman duties. Dealing with flowers and bow ties isn't really my style." He gave a playful glance. "Thankfully, I escaped for a bit. And now, I'm really glad I did." For the first time that evening, Sophie felt like she wasn't the only one out of place. There was something about Julian, genuine, unpretentious, that eased her guard. They talked about simple things: food, music, her favorite bookstore. Julian listened intently, the way few people ever did. After a while, the band began playing a slow, classic tune. "Would you like to dance?" Julian asked, offering his hand. Sophie hesitated. "I should warn you, I'm not very good at it." "Lucky for you, I am," he said, smiling, his eyes lit with charm. "Trust me." And she did. Her hand slid into his as they walked onto the floor. The moment his arm circled her waist, Sophie felt herself floating. Julian moved with practiced ease, guiding her steps with such confidence that she forgot to be nervous, forgot anyone else was watching. "You're full of surprises, Sophie Caldwell," Julian murmured as they turned gracefully. She looked up, laughing softly. After their dance, Julian and Sophie returned to table 9. The chairs were thinning out now, guests drifting off for dessert, photos, or cocktails at the bar. But inside Sophie's mind, everything was still spinning, like the waltz hadn't truly ended. She felt light, almost joyful, which was far from what she expected when she walked into the ballroom that evening. Julian had made her feel seen, really seen, not just another misplaced guest at a wedding too grand for her world. But as she sat down, Sophie's eyes briefly landed on Julian's wrist. A watch, nothing flashy or oversized, but so meticulously crafted, even she, who knew next to nothing about watches, could tell it was expensive. Very expensive. Then other details came rushing back, the confidence in his posture, the way his smile always arrived at just the right moment, the look the waitstaff had given him, not polite, but deferential. "So," Sophie began, keeping her voice light, "what do you actually do for work?" He paused, still holding her hand. "It's a bit complicated." "Try me." "I run a few companies, mostly in tech." But Sophie noticed the caution in his voice, the expensive watch on his wrist, the way the staff treated him. Clearly, he wasn't just anyone. "Are you famous?" "If I am, does it matter?" The question hung between them like a quiet challenge. Sophie looked at him and saw the hurt beneath the confidence. "I don't know. I guess it depends on the kind of famous." "The kind that makes people stop being genuine." She nodded slowly. "Are you analyzing me?" he asked. "No, just curious," she admitted. "Well then," he said, smirking slightly. "Permission granted." The line sounded playful, but there was truth beneath it. A door creaked open, but not wide enough to step through yet. Sitting beside her was still Julian, the man who had made her feel special all evening. But beneath the easy charm and graceful poise, there was clearly a world he hadn't invited her into yet. And Sophie, whether she was ready to admit it or not, wanted to know everything about that world. The wedding had begun to wind down. The golden lights softened into a warm hush and the music faded into gentle background notes. The bride and groom still beamed at the center of the room, but guests were starting to trickle out. At table 9, Sophie and Julian sat quietly side by side. No words needed, but everything understood. "I should probably head home," Sophie said softly, checking her watch. Julian nodded, though his eyes lingered on her a moment longer. "Do you need me to call a car for you?" Julian asked, his voice gentle. "No, thanks," Sophie smiled. "I'll take the subway. It's not far." He nodded. No protest, no insistence. They stood there for a moment longer, not moving, not speaking, each of them trying to stretch the moment just a little further, as if aware of how temporary it all was. Finally, Julian offered a soft smile, his gray eyes earnest. "It was really nice meeting you, Sophie Caldwell." "You too, Julian Hart." A beat of silence passed. Then Julian reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and hesitated for just a second before handing it to her. "If you don't mind, could I have your number?" Sophie looked at him, her heart skipping. She took the phone, typed in her name and number, and handed it back. Julian glanced at the screen and smiled. "I'll call," he said. "I'm not about to let the girl from table 9 just disappear." Sophie laughed, a little shy, a little thrilled. She rose to her feet, adjusting her coat. "Good night, Julian Hart." "Get home safe, Sophie Caldwell." No hug, no rush, just two people parting with a quiet promise hanging in the air. As Sophie stepped outside the hotel, the night air wrapped around her shoulders, cool and quiet. She shivered, but maybe it wasn't the breeze. Maybe it was the leftover hum from that last dance still echoing inside her. On the subway ride home, she leaned her head against the window, watching city lights blur past like snapshots of a dream. She couldn't stop thinking about the way Julian had looked at her, not with scrutiny or pity, but with real curiosity, real kindness. For the first time in a long time, she hadn't felt small. Across the city, Julian sat in the back seat of his car, tie loosened, top button undone. But his thoughts were far from the luxury around him. They kept circling back to a girl in an olive green dress, the one at table 9, with eyes warmer than the chandeliers above them. He had met countless people, in meetings, galas, fleeting social encounters. But no one had made him pause, truly pause, the way Sophie did. There was something genuine in her, something untouched by the polished world he lived in, like she belonged to a life he once longed for and had almost forgotten. Neither of them knew if they would ever see each other again. But as the night closed around them, one thing was certain: neither of them would forget the other. Julian called the next morning, just as he had promised. His voice over the phone made Sophie pause in the quiet hallway of her apartment. Deep and warm, it wasn't forced or polished. It was simply sincere. "Good morning, Sophie. Did you sleep well?" She gave a soft laugh, hugging the long cardigan around her shoulders, her eyes still laced with the remnants of a dream. "Not really? Last night felt like some strange, beautiful dream I haven't quite woken up from." "Then let me prove it was real," he said, gently but with certainty. "Are you free for lunch?" "I'm working all day at the library," she said, a little regretful. "Until 6. Then 7 o'clock. I'll pick you up. Dinner, something simple. No chandeliers, no tuxedos, I promise." Sophie hesitated. "I could just meet you there." Julian paused for a beat, a quiet moment, but one that felt deep. "I want to pick you up. That's honest." At exactly 7 p.m., a sleek black car pulled up in front of the old city library where Sophie worked. She stepped outside, still holding the half-read book from her break, wearing a simple cream-colored linen midi dress and worn ballet flats. Her hair was tied low in a casual knot, a few strands falling loosely around her face. She wore no makeup, but when she opened the car door, all of it, the simplicity, the softness, collided with a different kind of world. Rich brown leather seats, a softly glowing digital dashboard, and the scent of sandalwood and polished wood subtly filling the space. Julian was seated in the back, no bodyguard, no busy laptop. Just him, in a white button-down shirt, sleeves rolled neatly up to his forearms, the top 2 buttons undone. Despite the simplicity, everything on him, from the Swiss watch to the Mont Blanc pen peeking from his chest pocket, spoke of a world Sophie had never stepped into. "You have a personal driver?" she asked quietly, as she closed the door behind her. "Yes?" Julian turned to her, his eyes gentle. "I travel a lot." Sophie pressed her lips together. "I'm still trying to understand who you really are." Julian looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "I'm still the man who sat across from you at table 9. But if you want to know more, tonight I won't hide anything." The restaurant was perched on the rooftop of a renovated historical building. No flashy signs, no loud music. Just candlelight, polished oak tables, and floor-to-ceiling glass revealing a breathtaking view of New York City glowing beneath the night sky. There was no hostess leading them. A man in a charcoal vest simply bowed when he saw Julian and showed them to a corner table, softly lit and private. The food was minimal, just a few refined French dishes, elegantly plated. Sophie had never been in a place like this. But what overwhelmed her wasn't the setting. It was the way Julian looked at her, focused, quiet, and never distracted. Between soft jazz notes and flickering candlelight, he began to share. About Heart Innovations, the software company he started at 27 in a tiny garage in Brooklyn, now present in over 40 countries. About the early years of coding through the night, surviving on cheap coffee, and falling asleep on his keyboard. About the moment he had to choose between passion and venture capital, and chose both at the cost of solitude. "I don't like galas," Julian admitted, his voice lowering. "But they became part of the job, and over time, I stopped knowing which version of me was real." He paused, swirling his red wine slowly. "Maybe I got lost in the role everyone expected." Sophie watched him quietly. Then softly, she asked, "So, what am I in the middle of all that?" Julian looked up. There was a shift in his eyes, something tender and raw. "You're the one thing I didn't have to rehearse. No strategy, no filter. You remind me that there was once a version of Julian who could smile without calculating everything." On the way home, light rain began to fall. Julian gently leaned across to shield her from the rain with his hand as he opened the car door. The drive was slow, winding through quiet streets, the yellow streetlights casting golden reflections on the wet windows like an old film. When they arrived at a small two-story building perched above a cozy art cafe, Julian looked up at the apartment above and smiled faintly. "Very different world," he murmured. "Completely," she nodded. Julian turned to her, and the confidence of a CEO faded, replaced by something unguarded. "But I'm not afraid of that difference. I'm only afraid that you won't let me in." Sophie placed her hand on the car door handle, then stopped, turning back. "You've already stepped in," she said softly, just loud enough to rise above the rain. And then she closed the door gently. The car drove off, but someone's heart stayed behind on that quiet doorstep. And in the hush of a rainy night, something real had just begun. From that night on, there were no more vague questions or cautious distance between them. Julian didn't let the evening fade away like a chance encounter. The very next morning, he sent Sophie a simple yet clear message. "If you're open to it, from today, let's make this something real." Sophie reread it twice, maybe 3 times, before a small smile tugged at her lips. She replied just as simply, "I'm open to it." And just like that, their relationship began. Not rushed, not flashy, but full of quiet intentions. There were midday coffee drop-offs when Sophie had short breaks at the library and slow walks in the park after work. Sometimes they talked about everything, sometimes about nothing at all. Julian was no longer the untouchable tech CEO. He was the man who'd wait outside in the rain just to hand her an umbrella. The man who sat through an indie film on a tiny theater bench, completely lost in the plot, but content because Sophie loved it. And in return, Sophie slowly stepped into his world, attending product launches and tech events, holding his hand as cameras clicked, no longer shrinking from the unfamiliar. But what truly tied them together wasn't the grand gestures. It was the peace they found sitting side by side. It was the way Julian's eyes softened every time she spoke about books or painting. It was the fact that he never tried to change her, only wanted to be part of the world she already called home. And so, they were officially together, quietly, but with the kind of certainty that didn't need to be announced. 3 days after their dinner, Julian sent Sophie a text early Friday morning. "The world's getting too loud. I need to escape it for a bit. Want to come with me?" Just one line, but it made Sophie's heart race. No gala, no spotlight, just a quiet invitation. Honest and simple, she replied, "Yes, as long as I don't have to pack a gown." 3 days later, Julian picked her up in a modest sedan. No driver, no luxury car. He wore jeans and a soft t-shirt, hair tousled by the morning breeze. And when he smiled, he wasn't the billionaire CEO, just a man excited to share something secret. They drove north, leaving skyscrapers behind for winding, tree-lined roads. Cell service faded. Sophie looked at him sideways as he grinned. "We're about to lose signal. You good?" "As long as I don't lose you," she replied, softer than she meant. The cabin stood by a still lake, framed by tall pines. No internet, no TV, just nature and the sound of wind brushing the porch. "I bought this place a few years ago," Julian said as they carried bags inside. "When everything started moving too fast, I needed somewhere to remember who I was." They cooked together, Julian clumsy with carrots but patient as Sophie guided him. He splashed water while washing dishes, then laughed like a kid. They had homemade pasta and cheap wine, and to Sophie it tasted better than any five-star meal. In the afternoon, they walked along the lake. Julian told stories from his childhood, a kid obsessed with building computers, steered toward business school because that's what a heart should do. He spoke of his father, stern, legacy-driven, and the pressure to succeed until he lost sight of his own dreams. "I never wanted to be famous," Julian said as they sat on the wooden steps, watching the sky turn gold. "I just liked solving problems. But then success happened fast, and I stopped knowing who liked me for me." Sophie leaned her head on his shoulder, fingers intertwined. "You don't have to explain," she said. "I didn't come here for your company." Julian looked at her, eyes soft. "You're the first person who makes me feel human again, not a brand." That night they lay beneath a sky filled with stars, no cars, no city lights. Julian spread a blanket out beside the cabin. Sophie curled beside him, listening to crickets, wind, and the quiet sound of his breath. "You know something?" Julian murmured, gazing upward. "I'm afraid of thunderstorms." Sophie laughed and turned to him. "A billionaire? Afraid of thunder?" "Yep, and I sing terribly when I make coffee. But I'll sing for you if you promise not to run." She didn't answer, just wrapped her arm around him, a silent yes. The next morning, they made coffee in an old kettle. Julian, true to his word, hummed a clumsy tune from a classic song. Sophie watched him from the stool, chin resting on her palm, smiling like sunlight. When they packed to leave, Sophie glanced back at the cabin one last time. Not for the view, but because that cabin now held something precious. It was the first place she had seen the real Julian Hart, not the man in magazines, but the one who trusted her enough to take off the mask. After that weekend at the cabin, where silences were filled with glances, quiet midnight conversations, and the peace of simply sitting next to each other, everything between them had shifted. Not because they had changed, but because there was nothing left to hide. The layers they once wore to protect themselves had gently fallen away, willingly, without force. Julian was no longer the polished symbol of the tech world. Sophie was no longer the reserved librarian who kept her distance. They were simply two people, flawed, real, and they had made a choice: to stay. 2 weeks after their weekend at the lake, Julian invited her to a charity fundraiser, a gala for a tech education initiative for underprivileged children. It was a major event, attended by high-profile guests and media. Sophie hesitated. "Are you sure you want to bring me?" she asked as they sat at a little cafe near the library, their fingers laced together. "I don't know how to dress for something like that. I don't even know what to say to those people." Julian gently squeezed her hand. "I don't need you to fit in. I just want you there. Just be yourself." She nodded, not fully confident, but trusting the look in his eyes. The night of the gala, Sophie barely recognized herself in the mirror. A stylist arranged by Julian, never pushed, only suggested, had helped her choose a graceful aquamarine gown. Her hair was swept up in a soft bun, her makeup subtle, with just enough color to highlight her features. She still looked like Sophie, only more at ease in her own skin. When Julian arrived to pick her up, he stood still for a few seconds in front of her apartment door, wordless. He just stared. "You?" "Make it impossible to look away," he whispered at last, then reached out his hand. The ballroom shimmered under golden chandeliers. Leaders from the tech industry, finance, and media filled the room. Sophie walked beside Julian hand in hand, trying to stay calm as curious glances followed them. Some were surprised, others critical, and a few quietly impressed. But Julian never faltered. He introduced Sophie to everyone with quiet pride, as if she were the most valuable person in the room. Later, as Sophie stood chatting with a group of older philanthropists, sharing the meaning behind lavender in the language of flowers, Julian made his way to the bar. His sister, Vivian, was already there waiting. "You're different when you're with her," Vivian remarked, sipping her white wine. "You're not Julian Hart, the tech icon. You're just Julian." Julian smiled faintly, his eyes still on Sophie. "She reminds me who I was, before the company, before the cameras, before success became a mask I couldn't take off." Vivian tilted her head. "That's good, but the question is, do you think you're good enough for her?" The question stayed with Julian the rest of the night, quiet but persistent. The next day, Julian showed up at the library, where Sophie was hanging up posters for a children's reading event. He helped her with tape, held the ladder steady, wiped down windows. Other staff whispered to each other, smiling and stealing glances. "Is that the mystery guy who's been making Sophie smile all week?" one co-worker murmured. Julian just smiled and kept working. That afternoon, they had sandwiches at a tiny local shop, old wooden floors, a lazy ceiling fan spinning above. Julian sat on a creaky bench, shirt slightly wrinkled from the summer heat, biting into fries with childlike delight. "I like this life," he said, looking around. "It's real. No performances, no proving anything, just being." Sophie slipped her hand into his under the table. "And I like you when you're just you." That night, when Julian left Sophie's apartment, he paused on the front steps, the dim streetlight casting his shadow long against the brick path. "I've spent too long living in two worlds," he said softly, eyes on hers. "One of light, glamour, prestige. One of shadow, loneliness, pressure. But if I could choose now, I'd choose your world, even if it's smaller, simpler, because in it, I don't have to pretend." Sophie said nothing. She simply stepped down one stair, wrapped her arms around him, and kissed him. Gentle, but certain. A kiss that didn't ask questions. A kiss that answered them all. And right there, on old stone steps, beneath a quiet sky and the scent of summer rain, they truly began to step into each other's lives, not as two people from different worlds, but as two souls choosing to create one of their own. Small maybe, quiet surely, but real. Even though Julian and Sophie tried to guard their little world with quiet mornings, shared books and laughter over coffee, the outside world eventually crept in, uninvited. The whispers started as harmless curiosity. Then came the headlines. "Mystery woman seen on Julian Hart's arm at Tech Gala. Who is she?" A grainy photo, a half smile, just enough to stir the sharks. That afternoon, following a high-stakes meeting on global expansion, Richard Monroe, Julian's oldest business partner and longtime financial advisor, stepped into Julian's office and shut the door behind him. The air shifted. "We need to talk," Richard said, voice clipped. "About her." Julian didn't even look up from the tablet in his hand. "She has a name, Richard. Sophie Caldwell." "That doesn't matter right now." Julian finally looked up, eyes cold. "To me, it does." Richard sighed heavily and paced across the floor, tension in every step. "Julian, you're not a private citizen. You're the face of Hart Innovations. There are rumors. The investors are worried. Some of the board members think you're getting distracted. They're wondering if you're willing to risk the brand you built for a girl who doesn't even belong to this world." Julian sat back slowly, his jaw tightening. "You mean a girl who doesn't wear designer labels or speak in press releases?" "I mean a girl who could sink you without even meaning to," This world chews up people like her, and when it does, it drags you down with her." Silence fell. Then Julian spoke, low but razor sharp. "She knows how to listen, how to see people, not titles. She's kind in a way this industry forgot how to be. And if that's dangerous, maybe the real problem isn't her. It's us." That night, Julian showed up at Sophie's apartment with a box of her favorite tea and eyes clouded with thoughts he couldn't shake. They sat in the amber glow by her window, their knees touching, the steam from their mugs rising like breath between questions unspoken. Sophie saw it in him, the tension he carried like armor, and beneath it, a weariness so human it made her heart ache. "What happened?" she asked gently. He didn't sugarcoat it, told her everything, Richard's warning, the rumors, the pressure to retreat before it became too late. She didn't cry. She didn't get angry. She just looked at him with those calm, unwavering eyes. "If loving me puts your world at risk," she whispered, "I won't be the reason you lose it. You don't have to fight this battle. I can let go." Julian closed his eyes, the words hitting deeper than any boardroom threat. Then he leaned in, took her hand in both of his, and said quietly, "You're not the risk, Sophie. You're the reason I finally want something more than survival. I've spent my whole life being who the world needed me to be. But for the first time, I want to be who I choose." The next morning, Julian stood at the head of the boardroom, suited, composed, and utterly resolute. The room hushed as he placed his hands on the table and looked each member in the eye. "I've heard the concerns," he began, voice steady. "And I'll be honest, yes, I'm in a relationship. Her name is Sophie Caldwell, and no, she's not from our world." A pause, silence as thick as storm clouds. "But she's honest, brave, and she makes me better. I will not allow fear or image to dictate the people I choose to love. My private life is not a liability. And if that offends anyone's portfolio, you're free to walk." Gasps, murmurs, a few stunned stares. Julian stepped back, buttoned his jacket, and added one final sentence before turning toward the door. "For the first time in my life, I'm not selling anything. I'm choosing something." As the doors closed behind him, he felt it, not panic, not regret, but peace. Because this time, he wasn't just defending a company. He was fighting for something that finally felt like home. 6 months after they first met at Table 9, Julian brought Sophie back to the cabin by the lake. She thought it was just another weekend away, an escape from the city, a moment to recharge. But as the car turned down the tree-lined road, Sophie sensed something different. Julian had been quiet most of the drive, but his eyes held something weighty. As the sun dipped behind the trees, he led her down to the lake, the same place where they once sat, watching the sky turn violet and the breeze ripple the water. But this time, something had changed. Under the small wooden awning, tiny golden lights sparkled among the tree branches. On the wooden dock stretching out over the water, dozens of white flowers were arranged in the shape of a heart. It wasn't extravagant, but it was perfect. Gentle, intentional, unmistakably them. Julian turned to face her. His expression, usually so sure and steady, held a trace of nervous vulnerability. "Sophie," he began, his voice rough with emotion. 6 months ago, I was sitting at a table in the farthest corner of the room, bracing myself for another evening in a life that didn't feel like mine anymore." He slowly dropped to one knee, pulling a small velvet box from his jacket. "Then you walked in, quiet, genuine, and you changed everything." He opened the box, revealing a simple, delicate ring that shimmered like a falling star. "I don't need a perfect world. I just need one with you in it. Sophie Caldwell, will you marry me?" Sophie raised her hands to her mouth, eyes filling with tears, smile breaking wide. "Yes, of course yes," she whispered. "I will." 1 year after that fateful night at Table 9, Sophie walked into the chapel, not as a forgotten guest, but as the bride. She didn't need anyone to guide her. Every step she took was sure, steady. Because at the end of the aisle, Julian Hart was waiting. His eyes never left hers, as if she were the only thing that existed in the room, filled with white flowers and candlelight. Sophie's wedding dress was simple and graceful, just like her. No layers of lace, no heavy embellishments. Just a gown that, when she first put it on, made Julian whisper, "This is you." Nothing more needed. The wedding was held in the same ballroom where they'd met, Astoria Grand. But this time, Sophie wasn't seated at table 9, tucked behind a floral column. She stood at the center, surrounded by love, acceptance, and a few people who had once doubted her. Vivian, Julian's sister, stood proudly as maid of honor. Sophie's co-workers from the library filled the front row, their eyes shimmering with tears. When it came time for the vows, Julian took her hand and said, "You were never part of the plan, but you became the one thing I never want to live without. You remind me of who I am, not because of success, but because of love." Sophie's reply was soft but unwavering. "You didn't rescue me from my life. You helped me rebuild it. You made me believe I was worth loving. And today I choose you, not because you're Julian Hart, but because you're the man who sat beside me at table 9 and truly listened." Now, as Julian and Sophie walk hand in hand through real life with messy mornings, long workdays, and laughter over burnt dinners, they know one thing for sure. Love doesn't always begin with fireworks. Sometimes it begins with a glance and grows because someone was brave enough to reach back. Sometimes all it takes is a table in the corner and a glance that changes everything. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment. We'd love to hear what it meant to you. And if you believe in quiet, honest love like Sophie and Julian's, don't forget to subscribe to Noah's Stories for more heartfelt tales. Thank you for being here. Truly.